You're watching Promethean Actions weekly class for March 1st, 2025 with Bob Ingram. Tonight, the murder of President McKinley and the creation of the Federal Reserve System. So let me hand it over to Bob right now.
Hi, folks. Some people who are on this call tonight might have been in the previous discussion 3 weeks ago on William McKinley, which dwelt on his economic policies. Uh, I'm not going to go through any of that tonight. And in fact, although this presentation is sort of a continuation of the discussion of McKinley, as you will see as we go along, I am really not going to talk much about McKinley in this presentation. Uh, the idea here tonight is to give people a sense of what happened after McKinley was murdered, the ramifications of that, which were in fact they represented um, one of the most critical turning points in the history of the United States, a turning point very much for the bad. And the ramifications of what occurred after McKinley's death really are still with us today. And even under some of the positive policies of people like Franklin Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, or some of the other presidents like Eisenhower who did good things. Um, Nevertheless, damage was done to the American Republic after McKinley's murder, which to this day has never fully been reversed. So that is what I'm going to talk about. Now, McKinley, as you probably know, was assassinated in 1901, and he was the third U.S. president to be assassinated in 36 years, which is not a very long period of time. Lincoln, then Garfield, then McKinley. And I'm not gonna talk about his assassination per se. What I would recommend for those of you who have not read our document on this is this publication, a police dossier. It is the British who murder our presidents. This was published by Promethean Action, and it has chapters on both the Lincoln and the McKinley assassination. And I would urge you all, you can get it on the Promethean Action website. I would urge all of you to get it and read it. But one of the points I want to make, which is made in the pamphlet, is that what you had through a good deal of the 19th century into the 20th century, into the period leading up to World War I, is what existed was what you could call an assassination bureau, run out of the city of London, run by the highest levels of the British oligarchy. There were, this is not precise, but you can break it down into two stages. The first was in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, 60s. This is sometimes referred to as Palmerston Zoo because it was an assassination bureau, and literally I mean an assassination bureau, run out of London by the British, sometimes British Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, who's also known as Henry John Temple, 3rd Viscount Palmerston. You know, he was a member of the British government, a leader of the British government, the Prime Minister, uh, controlled foreign affairs, and he created a network of assassins and terrorists which were deployed out of London. And that is the network that John Wilkes Booth was a member of. Um, Now, there's a second stage which develops later. And, I like to refer to it as Palmerston Zoo 2.0. Now, Palmerston is dead by this point, but is a very, very similar, not identical, but very similar operation. In 1881, there was a conference in London to create an organization called the International Social Revolutionary Congress. And this was an association which gathered together from many of the countries in continental Europe anarchist terrorists. And, they didn't really form a rigid, structured organization, but it was very much an association of like-minded individuals who then began to operate out of London in the 1880s, 1890s, and all the way up to World War I. It was this entire operation was sponsored and protected by the highest levels of the British aristocracy. And in fact, Emma Goldman, who was an anarchist and who was the sort of the sponsor of Leon Czolgosz, the man who assassinated William McKinley, Emma Goldman later wrote in her autobiography that during this period, quote, and I'm quoting from her, anarchist activities flourished in London. England was the haven for refugees from all lands who carried on their work, that is, anarchist, terrorist, assassination work, who carried on their work without hindrance from the British authorities. And in fact, the personal sponsor, financier, and protector of Emma Goldman was Bertrand Russell from the Russell family. Now, over a period of 20 to 30 years, this network of anarchist assassins carried out numerous assassinations and even a larger number of assassination attempts. We're talking, in the dozens and dozens of assassinations and assassination attempts. Among those who were murdered were Tsar Alexander II of Russia in 1881, the President of France, Sadi Carnot, in 1894, Empress Elizabeth of Austria in 1898, King Umberto of Italy in 1900, King Carlos I of Portugal in 1908. Then in there you have the assassination of William McKinley in 1901, the Russian Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin in 1911, and then King George I of Greece in 1913. So these were numerous assassination attempts, numerous assassinations and assassination attempts. Attempts were also carried out on the King of Belgium, the Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul, the King of Spain, and many, many others, all deployed and all part of this anarchist terrorist haven in the city of London. Now, there was also something else going on at the same time. So we're talking about, the Palmerston Zoo, and then later this anarchist terrorist network, through the last half of the 19th century and into the early 20th century. There was another phenomenon which went on simultaneous with this, and that was the creation of the British central banking system. And I'll just mention some dates to you here. because it's really, I think, revelatory. Um, you have the case of France, and France really, the French central bank, for all practical purposes, became a subsidiary, a puppet of the Bank of London, Bank of England, after 1815, after the defeat of Napoleon. And during the 19th century, the French banking system very much operated as a subsidiary of the City of London banking powers. But then, after the Civil War, the U.S. Civil War, uh, we start to get the installation of central banks throughout Europe and elsewhere in the world. These are all, every single one of them, modeled on the Bank of England. And they are all, what they are creating is a global monetarist system, a global imperial financial system. Now, the Bank of Austria was created in 1873. The Bank of Germany, the Reichsbank, was created in 1875. The Japanese Central Bank was created in 1883. The Swedish Central Bank in 1897. The Russian Central Bank in 1897. The Belgium Central Bank in 1900. The Swiss Central Bank in 1905. The Danish Central Bank in 1908. And during this period, the British also created central banks in almost all of their larger, most important colonies, including central banks in Canada, Australia, India, New Zealand, and South Africa, all modeled on the Bank of England. This was all accomplished within a period of about 30 to 35 years, right? And so by the time you get to the assassination of McKinley, you already have in place a global central banking system, which really is headquartered in the City of London and is carries out its operations according to the monetarist theories of the London of the British oligarchy and the banking crowd in the City of London. Now, I think it's worth taking a moment to just look at, you know, what this whole system is based on. Now, I want to actually reference here, and I'm just going to just very briefly, two books that I have written, which I think are relevant to this discussion. One is a book entitled The Modern Anglo-Dutch Empire, Its Origins, Evolution, and Anti-Human Outlook. The Modern Anglo-Dutch Empire. And the second one is simply entitled National Banking, with a picture of Alexander Hamilton on the cover. These two books go into far more depth than what I am going to do tonight. And they're both available for purchase on Amazon. But I think it's useful to look at the philosophical principles involved. I mean, the central banking system as a system, not just as institutions, but as a monetary and financial system, is really based on what Lyndon LaRouche called the oligarchical principle. And that principle, among other things, defines wealth and power as the accumulation of financial aggregates. Whether those aggregates are US dollars, British pounds, gold, silver, or today, say things like Bitcoin. But you have these financial aggregates, and that these things have essentially intrinsic wealth in and of themselves. That's their sort of species characteristic. That these things represent wealth, and that power and riches can be accomplished by the accumulation of these, wealth aggregates. Um, Now, this is the oligarchical view. This is their view of money. This is their view of economics. And it didn't start with the British, it goes way back. The Roman Empire was based on this notion of wealth. And you could go back a lot further than the Roman Empire. If you look at the uh, periods of feudalism and things like the Lombard League and all of this is all based on this same identical definition, oligarchical definition of wealth. Um, and the um, and the British Empire uh, not only is based on this principle, but what came out of the British Empire was the successful effort to impose this kind of an oligarchical financial system on the entire world. And the philosophical roots of this system, are to be found in people like John Locke, William Petty, and others from that period. And then when you get into the 19th century and into sort of the heyday of British free trade economics, the kind of things that Friedrich Hayek loves. When you get into this, you get into people like Adam Smith and Richard Cobden and the Mills, James Mill, John Stuart Mill, and many other people like that. You know, um, uh, this is oligarchical economics, oligarchical finance. Now, on the other hand, I'm not going to get into a long discussion of American system economics. It would take too long. But what I want to do is look at just briefly, look at what Abraham Lincoln did between 1861 and 1865, or just mention it really, not even discuss it that much, which not only was contrary to this oligarchical system, but which, as these policies were implemented and then imitated by sovereign nations around the world, posed a direct threat, a deadly threat to the interests of the British Empire and the British financial system. Essentially, there's a lot of things that Lincoln did, but certainly two of the most important things he did was he created a system, or a system which had two components. Number one, of very, very high protective tariffs, which continued after his death all the way up until through McKinley. And secondly, he created a productive credit system, which was a combination of the two national banking acts, which were passed by his administration, and the greenback policy. And the greenback policy was critical to the success of the national banking acts, because what it created was a flow, a continual flow of productive credit, sovereign productive credit, U.S. Treasury notes, sovereign productive credit into building up the productive economy of the United States. And it had a massive impact. I mean, I don't have all of the statistics, but, I know that in a certain period, and I don't know what the beginning date and the end date of this, it might have been right after Lincoln, it might have been later under McKinley. I'm just not sure, and I apologize for it. But there was a certain period of time there where, under the influence of these policies, coal production in the United States increased by 800%. Railway track mileage increased by 600%. Wheat production increased by 300%. And there were many, many other things like this, which many other statistics you could point to just show the explosion of productive economic activity in this country and the effect that had on the American people and the opportunities for the American people. Now, what began to happen, you know, during this period of this economic miracle that Lincoln's policies had created, is that other countries in the world they started looking at the United States and looking at what we were doing and studying the measures that were being implemented. And then other nations began to adopt the same policies. Um, One of the most important of these was what happened in Germany, where in 1879, Otto von Bismarck, the German chancellor, junked the German free trade policies. They had had free trade policies up to that point. He junked them and adopted protectionism and began to erect high protective tariffs modeled on what the United States had done. That was in 1879. It's interesting to note that the year prior to that, in 1878, he had held lengthy meetings, personal in-face meetings, with Ulysses Grant, who was then embarked on a world tour, and they met in Berlin and had extensive talks. And Grant himself was a champion of the protective system, the high tariff system. There was also an individual in Germany at that time named Wilhelm von Kardorff, who was an economist who was a close personal friend of Bismarck. And Kardorff himself was a student of Henry Carey, the American economist, had studied Henry Carey's works, and he lobbied intensively for the adoption of protectionism. He also tried to get Germany to adopt a bimetal system of silver and gold, something which McKinley tried to do later. But in addition to Germany, you had in Japan, after the Meiji Restoration in 1867, in Russia, they began to adopt protectionist policies, and in 1891 they began to build the Trans-Siberian Railroad, modeled directly on the American Railroad, Transcontinental Railroad in the United States. And similar initiatives were taken in terms of protectionism, in terms of public credit, in terms of railroads and infrastructure. Similar things were taken in a number of other countries, including China and a number of other countries. Then in 1897, when McKinley comes in, he introduces the policy of reciprocity, trade reciprocity, where he says, we welcome other countries erecting tariffs. We welcome other countries developing their own economies. And we're going to introduce a policy of reciprocity where we will negotiate with other countries as sovereign countries, and we are going to negotiate and the terms of the various tariff agreements and trade agreements, so that all countries can benefit from this kind of productive economic growth. So this is where we were. On the one hand, the British carrying out an assassination bureau, murdering one political leader after another, destabilizing countries, throwing countries into chaos, while they simultaneously are erecting their global system of private central banking, imperial central banking. And on the other hand, you've got countries beginning to copy and imitate and implement their own versions of protectionist economic measures and economic development measures to build up their own productive economies. And then with McKinley proposing an alliance of sovereign nations, for global economic development around his policy of reciprocity. That's where we are in 1901. That is the point at which McKinley is murdered by an anarchist assassin who is part of the network of anarchist assassins run out of the city of London under the protection of people like Bertrand Russell. So that's where you are in 1901. Now, what I'm going to devote the rest of this discussion to is what happened after McKinley was murdered. Well, just briefly, I mean, the first thing that happened, or not the first thing, but one of the most important things that happened was that McKinley's tariff system was dismantled. Um, it was close to 50%, 40 as an average rate. It varied, but it was 45 to 50% at the time he was killed. But it was lowered under Teddy Roosevelt. It was lowered again under Taft, not that much, 5, 10%, 15%. But it would, by the time Woodrow Wilson comes in, it's significantly lower. It's like 35% or something, roughly. But then Woodrow Wilson slashes it. Woodrow Wilson cuts tariff rates to 13%. And that's the end. That's the end of protectionism, in the United States. And it was raised a little bit later by Harding and Coolidge, but it never got anywhere near close to what as a permanent system to what had existed in really for 40 years from Abraham Lincoln through to William McKinley. But then you get, putting the tariffs to one side, you get to the question of banking and finance. And this is where the real attack comes in. What I want to just mention, though, or what I want to precede that discussion with is just referencing the financial and banking attacks which the British waged against the United States, even beginning before the McKinley presidency, because these kind of attacks were ongoing. Excuse me. But there were three major attacks worth mentioning. The first of these were called panics. That was the term they used back then. And if you want to know why we don't use that term today, like for instance, why 2008 was not referred to as a panic, this is just a little humorous anecdote. We had panics in American history, banking crisis, runs on banks, banking collapses, corporations going bankrupt, and they were called panics. And when the 1929 stock market crash occurred, people started calling it the Panic of 1929 because it was just like the earlier ones, just like it. And Herbert Hoover insisted, oh no, this is not a panic. Oh, don't call it a panic. This is a mere depression. It's a mere depression. So it was actually Herbert Hoover who came up with the term depression because he wanted to make it seem like it wasn't a real panic. But anyway, there were three of these things in the period we're talking about here. The first was the Panic of 1873. I'm not going to talk about it. It was a lot like the two that came after it. But the main importance of the Panic of 1873 was that this was the panic that was used to destroy the greenbacks. The greenbacks were the Specie Resumption Act, which was passed in 1875, was passed as a direct consequence of the Panic of 1873. So the Panic of 1873 was used by the British and by Wall Street to destroy Lincoln's greenbacks. But the two that I'm going to talk about are the Panic of 1893 and the Panic of 1907, because these were direct foreign attacks on the United States. They were both organized out of the city of London. The Panic of 1893 began with the British popping or pulling the plug, on several financial bubbles outside of the United States, in Argentina, in Australia, in South Africa, where there were speculative bubbles of one sort or another. And the British pulled the plug on this, and the city of London, and this set off panic selling and panic buying and runs on banks. Um, and in the midst of this, what happened is that London bankers began dumping American stocks, and they began buying up American funds that were backed by gold. And because the stocks were not backed by gold. This led to a collapse of the New York Stock Exchange, and then the British began trading in their treasury and other bonds that were gold backed. The British began trading them in, which began a run on the U.S. Treasury gold reserves. As this developed, the Wall Street banks contributed to this, J.P. Morgan and others, and there were the various financial bubbles inside the United States began to pop. There were runs on banks, and all of this just began to explode. As this panic unfolded, gold exports from the United States increased by 700%. This is gold. Remember, we're on the British gold standard here, right? This is, 1893. We're on the British gold standard, de facto. And the gold exports increased by 700%. And this means gold flowing out of U.S. banks, flowing out of U.S. financial institutions, and the gold is all going to London, to Paris, to Amsterdam, and to other financial centers in Europe. The entire financial system in the United States began to melt down, and this then leads to a total collapse. I think I mentioned this in the earlier class, but the Northern Pacific Railway went bankrupt. The Union Pacific Railroad went bankrupt. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad went bankrupt. Over 15,000 companies went out of business. Over 500 banks closed their doors. Now, this is important because overwhelmingly, it wasn't the large Wall Street banks that went out of business. It was the smaller banks in the Midwest, the western part of the United States, the Great Plains, the West Coast, and the South, right? Outside of the Northeast. Uh, Local banks, smaller, medium-sized local banks were wiped out by the hundreds. And, the people who came out of this crisis, the only people who came out of this crisis with increased power was what was called the Morgan Belmont Syndicate on Wall Street, which was a group of banks, including Drexel Bank, Morgan and Company, August Belmont and Company, N.M. Rothschild and Sons, J.P. Morgan and Company, and they emerged from the 1893 panic essentially with almost dictatorial power or near dictatorial power over the banking system in the United States. coming out of the 1893 panic. Then you had the Panic of 1907. This is after McKinley's assassination. Teddy Roosevelt is now president, I believe. 1901, or no, I guess. Well, I think Teddy Roosevelt is president. Might have been Taft, but I'd have to go back and add and subtract. Not going to do that right this moment. But this was almost a replay. It was different. There were different, components to it, but it was almost a replay of the Panic of 1893. And again, this was provoked directly from London, not in the same way, but it originated in actions taken by the Bank of England and the City of London banking establishment. During the years leading up to this, the Bank of England had kept interest rates in the range of 3 to 4%. They had, their basic interest rates were 3 to 4%. In 1907, they abruptly jacked up their interest rate to 7%. Immediately, all of the other central banks in Europe, and remember, this is 1907, so we now have the central banking system already in place. And immediately, the other central banks followed suit. So globally, interest rates jumped from 3 to 4% up to 7%. This caused a global panic, a global crisis, of which what happened in the United States was just part of it. This was not, you read these people, they talk about, the New York crisis was caused by the trusts, by Knickerbocker Trust and what have you. What happened to the trusts was a result of this panic. It was not the cause of the panic. The panic actually started outside the United States, in countries like Japan, in Chile, in Italy, in Egypt, in Argentina, in Germany. As nation after nation, the banking systems were plunged into crisis. And then it hit the United States. And what happened as the crisis hit the United States is that in late 1907, all of the major British, French, and Dutch banks, and these are the banks holding a lot of U.S. financial assets. These are the banks that U.S. banks go to borrow on the global market, the British, French, and Dutch banks. In late 1907, the British, French, and Dutch banks cut off all credit to U.S. financial markets. That cutoff of credit precipitated the crash. The British, French, and Dutch banks began demanding that lenders make payment in gold or gold-backed securities. And gold began once again to flood out of the country. In September, in 1 month, $40 million of gold left the United States for British, French, and Dutch banks. And this put a huge strain on the U.S. Treasury. Now, the hardest hit of the financial institutions in the United States at this time were the trust companies. Now, the trust companies were very large financial institutions. They were not banks. If you want to try to get a sense of what they were, they have this term they use today called asset managers. This is a term that's used, and it's used to describe companies like Blackstone, KKR, and some of these other big financial institutions, which are not banks. And the trust companies back at that time were sort of like something similar to the asset managers of today, similar in other ways to investment banks. But, what they were large financial institutions which specialized in handling speculative investments and manipulating speculative debt. And they got hit very, very hard by the by the Panic of '97, with the cutoff of credit out of Europe, and the and a number of the larger of them got caught. I mean, it's similar in some ways. It's not identical to what happened to Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns in the 1908 in the 2008 crisis. And one of the largest ones, Knickerbocker Trust, went under. It was later taken over, kind of in the way that Bear Stearns was. But Knickerbocker Trust went under. There were others like the Trust Company of America, and a number of these trusts either went under or were pretty much destroyed, and huge financial losses were felt, huge banking losses, and the truth is that the Panic of 1907 lasted longer. It wasn't quite as spectacular, but it lasted longer, months and months and months, and it had it did more permanent damage than the Panic of 1893. So out of the Panic of 1907, you get the big push for the Federal Reserve, right? This is when it starts. Now, again, these were both panics essentially created and sparked by actions taken by the Bank of England, the British banking system, and the foreign central banks. They were aided and abetted by people like J.P. Morgan and some of the major Wall Street banking interests, right? But then they used these panics, particularly the Panic of 1907, to say, okay, this can't go on. We cannot have these kind of panics, this kind of, financial chaos and devastation. Therefore, we must change our financial and monetary system. Now, bear in mind that Lincoln's system, which had been greatly weakened at this point, the withdrawal of the greenbacks was really a terrible thing. The last of them were withdrawn in 1879, and the national banking system that Lincoln had created could not really function without the greenbacks. That is why they kept trying to bring silver in, like with the Silver Purchase Act of 1890, because they needed more credit, and without the greenbacks, they didn't have enough credit. But Lincoln's national banking system still existed, as weakened as it was. It still existed in 1907. And what the bankers said was, it's time to get rid of it. It's time to get rid of it. We've got to create something new. And actually, this even started, the talk of doing this, started before the Panic of 1907. There were people talking about this in 1905, 1906. And in fact, in 1906, the New York Chamber of Commerce issued a very lengthy report, which was delivered to every member of Congress and publicized. They issued a very lengthy report in 1906, calling for the establishment of a central bank in the United States modeled on the Bank of England, with branches throughout the country, which would enforce gold convertibility and control the flow of credit to the privately owned banking system in the United States. So that was put forward in 1906 by the New York Chamber of Commerce. But then in 1907, the campaign to create a central bank went into high gear. When Congress passed, well, actually in 1908, Congress passed what was called the Aldrich-Vreeland Act. And this act created a National Monetary Commission to study the problems of American banking and to make recommendations. It was chaired by Representative Edward Vreeland, who was a business partner of J.P. Morgan. Between 1909 and 1912, they conducted a 3-year study of the kind of changes that should be made. Now, as part of this study, um, uh, Aldrich personally and other members of the National Monetary Commission made repeated trips to Europe, where they met with the leading officials of the Bank of England, the Reichsbank in Germany, and other central bankers. And they studied in depth the functioning of the European central banking system. And then they came back to the United States, and the commission finished its work in 1912. Now, in the middle of all of this, in 1910, you have the infamous, notorious meeting at Jekyll Island in Georgia, which I'm not going to, too much. People, some people, you know, give it too much importance, but it's worth noting because what happened was that in 1910, a group of these people um, held a secret meeting, and I mean it was secret meeting, top secret meeting. They traveled incognito. They didn't use their last names. It's really kind of wild. They had a secret meeting in Jekyll Island, which is a little island off the coast of Georgia, where they hammered out their plan to create a central bank. Um, and at the meeting, I'll give you a few of the people who were at the meeting. Aldrich was there, Nelson Aldrich. Uh, Abraham Andrew, who was the Assistant Treasury of the U.S. Secretary, Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury. Frank Vanderlip, who was the president of the National City Bank of New York, which represented the international banking house of Kuhn Loeb and Company. Henry Davison, the senior partner of J.P. Morgan. Charles Norton, the president of J.P. Morgan. Benjamin Strong, the head of J.P. Morgan's Bankers Trust Company. And Paul Warburg, a partner in Kuhn Loeb and Company, which was the official representative of the Rothschild Bank in New York City. And it should also be mentioned that Paul Warburg's brother, Max Warburg, was the director of the Reichsbank, the central bank of Germany. And there were others there, but these are some of the people who were at that Jekyll Island meeting. And but the Jekyll Island meeting, you got to understand, comes in the midst of a number of these people and others traveling back and forth to Europe, spending a lot of time in London, a lot of time meeting with British officials, with Bank of London officials, visiting other central banks in Europe. So it's not like this was just some weird meeting in Georgia. They're all coming together, with the determined effort that they are going to impose a central bank on the United States. And in fact, one of the people who was at the Jekyll Island meeting was quoted later saying, quote, Aldrich entered this discussion at Jekyll Island already an ardent convert to the idea of a central bank. His desire was to transplant the system of the Bank of England bodily onto America. So, in 1912, the Monetary Commission wrote a bill to establish a central bank in the United States. Now, I have not looked into this um, that closely, so I'm not sure exactly what happened. But from what I have read, Taft, who was the president in 1912, was not favorable to the bill. I'm not sure why, but he let it be known that he would not support its passage. So it did not get through in 1912. But then in November of 1912, Woodrow Wilson gets elected, and in 1913, a new bill is introduced. Now, this has new sponsors, Carter Glass and Robert Owen. This is the same Carter Glass folks who later wrote the Glass-Steagall bill, so he's not all good. In 1913, a new bill was introduced called the Glass-Owen bill, and this bill became known as the Federal Reserve Act. And this was introduced. It was passed by both houses of Congress, and it was signed into law on December 23rd, 1913. Now, that is how we got the Federal Reserve. Now, I know I have already talked a long time, but I want to do something else here. So this may end up being one of my longer presentations. I want to do something else here because I want to do more than just give you dates and names and the chronology of how we got the Federal Reserve. I want to talk about the individual who led the fight against, and I mean led. He personally, and he wasn't the only one opposed to it. The Federal Reserve Bill did not pass unanimously. There were a number of people who voted against it. But he was the individual who, without question, led the fight against the passage of the Federal Reserve Bill. Now, the person I'm talking about is Charles Lindberg, who I think deserves to be recognized today for what he stood for and what he fought for. Now, I'm not talking about Charles Lindberg, the aviator who flew, to France. That's Charles Lindbergh Jr. That's the son of the man I'm talking about. I am talking about Charles Lindbergh Sr., who was actually an immigrant to this country. He actually was from Sweden, and he immigrated as a young boy to the United States, became a U.S. citizen, and he, had a long career not worth going into, but he ended up getting elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. He served in the U.S. House of Representatives for 5 terms for 10 years, from 1907 to 1917. He also, at the outbreak of the First World War, became a vehement opponent of the U.S. entering World War I on the side of the British. He did not vote against the war because he left office in March of 1917, and the declaration of war came later. But up to the point he left office, he was fighting tooth and nail to stop the U.S. entering World War I. So what I want to focus on is his fight against the Federal Reserve, and I am going to read to you some quotations from him, and a couple of them I'm going to read are fairly lengthy, but I don't see any other way to do it. But I will read you a short one first, because while the Federal Reserve Bill was being debated, this is 1913 on the floor of the Congress, Lindbergh gave a number of speeches, and in one of those speeches, he said the following, and this is just a short excerpt. He said, "This act, the Federal Reserve Act, this act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When the president signs this bill, the invisible government by the monetary power will be legalized. The people may not know it immediately, but the day of reckoning is only a few years removed. The worst legislative crime of the ages is being perpetrated by this banking bill. And after the act was passed and after the Federal Reserve was established, McKinley immediately introduced, not McKinley, Lindberg immediately introduced into the U.S. Congress articles of impeachment against every member of the Federal Reserve Board and charging that they were involved in, quote, a conspiracy to violate the Constitution and the laws of the United States. Now, Lindberg also wrote a number of works, both during and after the fight around the Federal Reserve. During the fight where he's fighting against the Federal Reserve, he wrote a book, this is in 1913, called Banking, Currency, and the Money Trust. And then he wrote others later. I'm going to quote from one of his later ones. In 1917, when he's fighting to stop our entry into World War I, he wrote a book called Why is Your Country at War? Now, the reason why I'm mentioning these two books in particular is to indicate what he was up against. So, 1913, he writes Banking, Currency, and the Money Trust. 1917, he writes Why Your Country is at War. In 1918, the U.S. government acted to seize every copy of this book that was circulating, these two books that was circulating in the United States. They were removed from every library. They were removed from every bookseller, every bookstore. Every single copy that was circulating was seized by the U.S. government. And then, believe it or not, U.S. agents located the person who had printed these books and seized the printing plates that the books had been printed upon and destroyed the printing plates so that no more copies could be printed of these two books. That was in 1918. Some of you may know this, but for decades, and I mean decades, 40 years, 50 years, 60 years, you could not get Lindbergh's books anywhere. You can get them now because they're on the internet. You can find them in places like the Internet Archive and places like that. But for decades, the only copies of Lindbergh's books were the ones that had been printed at the time, when they were put out, that people had privately held and secreted away, and they would circulate by hand, and some people would make mimeograph copies of them, but they were literally banned books for more than 50 years. So what I'm going to do, years later in 1923, in looking back at this fight around the Federal Reserve, Lindbergh wrote a book called The Economic Pinch. And I'm going to read you a fairly long quotation from The Economic Pinch because I want to give you a sense of how profound this fight was. This is what Lindbergh says. He says, the evidence before Congress in 1913 proved conclusively that the Federal Reserve Act was planned by Wall Street. It was clear to every congressman who would read it that the very persons who planned it were the leaders in control of the money trust, men who dominated the business interests to the point of strangling those not in league with them. The president appointed to the Federal Reserve Board one of the most prominent of the money trust group. All of the appointive members of the board follow the plans that exactly fit the money trust operations. The first words of the act are promises which the people assumed that Congress had made, that the banks established were a Federal Reserve, that is, government banks. That promise was a deliberate lie. The government does not own $1 of stock in the Federal Reserve banks. The title to the act was intended to charm all the innocent among us. But the truth is, it is a snake. I was a member of the Banking and Currency Committee in the House of Representatives when the Federal Reserve Act was passed. On that committee, I was the only member to strenuously oppose the act. I made a speech in Congress on January 20th, 1915, reviewing the original provisions of the act and opposing the entire act and any increase of its power. And then he quotes himself from 1915, and I'll read an excerpt of that quote. Congress, by the passage of the Federal Reserve Act, has placed it in the power of the money trust to make and determine prices of speculative and other commodities at its will. The president, in creating the Federal Reserve Board, appointed men who had been educated by the money trust system, believed in it, and knew no other. The Federal Reserve Act gives a power to the Federal Reserve banks that makes the government impotent to protect the people. The system is private. It is conducted for the sole purpose of obtaining the greatest possible profits from the use of other people's money, and in the interest of the stockholders and those allied with them. It is inconsistent with free government to subject every industry, every enterprise in the country to the domination and dictatorship of the big banks, which have been granted the exclusive privilege to control our finances. Now, that's the end of him quoting himself, but I'm going to keep reading from the economic pinch. The national and international banking groups that control finance have prospered. They prosper because they dominate the Federal Reserve banks. The Federal Reserve banks dominate the other banks. Therefore, the big bankers dominate the entire financial system. The law forces the country banks to withdraw funds from their own communities to support the Federal Reserve banks. And that way, the entire country is compelled by law and practice to finance the big bankers and finance whatever they choose to promote, while the useful people themselves are deprived. To get anything really permanent, to change this, the people must move and act with solidarity to impress upon the legislative bodies and on the executive and on the Supreme Court that all of their actions must be based on the words of the preamble to the U.S. Constitution to promote the general welfare and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Now, it's already late, so maybe I can read it in the, well, I think I should read it. You know, this might go till 5:30 or whenever, because in 1913, in his book on the money trust, it's a long, long book, hundreds of pages, but there's a section in there entitled Money, Money. And I want to read to you two paragraphs from that section because it gives you a sense of how Lindbergh's mind works. He says, in many respects, money is the strangest of all human creations. On the one hand, it has civilized the world, and on the other, has commercialized and in a manner criminalized the people. But that is not because the purpose of money is erroneous. It is because the office of true money has been usurped by false money, which has served as a false god. And the worship of this false god has caused the degradation of the soul of humanity. None of the dramatic stages through which humanity has passed has been as intense and complicated as that through which it is now passing. That is because a false system has been established, and the longer humanity attempts to struggle forward under it, the more severe the struggle will become. What is it that makes money of a piece of gold or a slip of engraved and printed paper? It is neither the bearer of the gold nor the banker who circulates paper. It is the government guarantee of the people's credit and support that gives it credit, that gives it currency. Not a cent of the value that is in the gold coin, except its worth, as jewelry, rightfully belongs to the owner of the bullion. Not a penny in a bank bill rightfully belongs to the banker. Whatever power of purchase there is in either gold or paper is purely of government origin. It is the people's credit. Honest money is nothing but credit. The people are the government. Therefore, the government should, as the Constitution provides, regulate the value of money. There is no other real sovereign power because all authority emanates from the people. So that's Charles Lindbergh. Now, to end, so what happens? The fight is lost. The Federal Reserve is established. So the Federal Reserve Bill is passed to get an idea, because we're not just talking about banking and finance here. The turning point, the catastrophe that occurred after McKinley's murder. So the Federal Reserve Bill passes in December 1913, goes into effect. So by the end of 1913, we have the Federal Reserve. But two other things happen in 1913. First of all, in 6 months earlier, in May, the 16th Amendment becomes law. That's the law which establishes the income tax, the Internal Revenue Service, and the income tax. And one of the things that is critical to understand, and the income tax comes in May, the Federal Reserve in December. You could not have the Federal Reserve without the income tax. The income tax was essential because what you're doing is you are essentially creating a system where government debt will become the basis for the Federal Reserve. And the government debt is contingent upon squeezing more and more money out of the American people. So the income tax goes into effect in 1913. And also in 1913, and people might think this is unrelated, but I don't. Again, in May of 1913, the Rockefeller Foundation is founded. And this is the first of what would become the huge family foundations, which after 1913, through the Rockefeller Foundation and others that, come after them, the other major family foundations. And again, these people involved in these foundations are all members in good standing of what Lindbergh called the money trust. They begin to establish, through these foundations, essentially a private oligarchical parallel government in the United States, a policy-making apparatus completely outside of the elected representatives of the American people, right? So 1913, the Federal Reserve, the income tax, the Rockefeller Foundation. Then, of course, you've got World War I, which I'm not going to dwell on. Teddy Roosevelt was perhaps the most vocal and, I don't know, important, but certainly demanding entry into World War One. And then at the end of the war, in 1919, you have this meeting in Paris in 1919 between top level British and American government officials and oligarchs, where the decision is made for a permanent Anglo-American alliance, and the decision is made to create something called the International Institute of the Institute of International Affairs, and that organization never gets created as one organization, but essentially it gets created as two symbiotic organizations, one in London, the Royal Institute for International Affairs, and the other in New York, the Council on Foreign Relations. And this creates the special relationship, the partnership, the British-American alliance coming out of World War One. So you look at where we were in 1901 with William McKinley giving his speech on reciprocity at the Buffalo Exposition, and you look at where we ended up in 1919, 18 years, a catastrophic turning point in American history. And where are we today? The Federal Reserve, the foundations, all these NGOs and everything, this all comes out of the foundations, you know? It's oligarchical rule. So, the assassination of McKinley was a coup d'etat, but it wasn't simply a coup d'etat to replace one person with another. It was a coup d'etat to destroy the American Republic of Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and many, many other patriots. So that's it, folks.